to get started. Thank you, everyone, for dialing in. This panel is on supply chain traceability in retail. I'm joined here by some great speakers that we're really excited to introduce you to. Nate Herman, the SVP of Policy at the American Apparel and Footwear Association. Forrest, the Assistant General Counsel at Lowe's Companies. And Gert Leroux, Aquaculture and Fisheries Specialist at Woolworths. And myself, Marissa, I am the Senior Director of Policy and Government Affairs at Sourcemap. Thank you to my fellow panelists. Excited to dive into today's discussion. Nate, we're going to get started with you here. So in your role at AAFA, you track and analyze the impact of relevant legislations for AAFA's more than 1,000 members. What can you tell us about the future of supply chain traceability for the retail industry? Is there any legislation that you're tracking particularly closely, and any insights that you can share to sort of kick us off here?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me today. This is a great event, and so happy to be a part of it. But to answer your question, basically traceability is here today. There's no way to any longer avoid the issue of traceability in your supply chains. It is required in a lot of legislation that you have that traceability in order to meet the requirements and come into compliance with those regulations and legislation. And eventually, it'll be required for you to share your traceability with the public writ large. And so along those lines, the legislation that we're watching in this space that are really driving the need for traceability in supply chains as the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act here in the United States, or UFLPA, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive in Europe, as well as other legislation in Europe, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the Digital Product Passport, and lots of other legislation in Europe. But also, again, when we're talking about traceability, you need traceability in your supply chains in order to conduct the due diligence that's required under those laws. But there is also pending legislation here in the United States called the Fashion Act, which is pending in New York, pending in Washington State, and Massachusetts, and also could be introduced in the state of California, which actually would require companies to publish their supply chain maps, at least through the first tier, but in many cases up through back to the raw material. And so not only are you required to have traceability in your supply chains to manage and comply with all the due diligence requirements that already exist out there, but you might have to publish that and share that with the public as well.
Thank you so much for those insights, Nate. I know that particularly for the majority of Sourcemap's customers and the companies that we work with, they are always exposed to more than one upcoming due diligence regulation. So it's really important to not just keep a calendar of when do these go into effect, but really ensuring that you have a multifaceted approach to prepare to comply with these regulations, because it can the number is only getting larger of governments that are really cracking down on risks in the upstream supply chain. So thank you so much for sharing those insights. Gert, I want to transfer over to you here. Woolworths, based in South Africa, you haven't been exposed to some of the major supply chain due diligence regulations in the US and the European Union, which have been a major topic of discussion over the course of our conference today. But despite that, traceability appears to still be a really important priority for your business. Can you share why this is important to Woolworths, and sort of how you are prioritizing this?
Hi, Marissa. Yeah. Also, thank you very much for inviting me to the conference. I'll start off just with a little bit of Woolworths background. We are a premium quality retailer, trading in more than 400 stores, mostly in South Africa, but also in 10 other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But increasingly for sustainability as well. Our vision is to be one of the world's most responsible retailers. So for Woolworths, the push towards traceability is really internal to the company. We have a dedicated sustainability program called the Good Business Journey. 5 major goals in that program, and one of them is a fully traceable and transparent supply chains by 2025. So if I look at the rationale for that, I think there's part of the classical rationale. It's about risk mitigation within our supply chains. But for Woolworths, really, it's more than that. We want to get closer to our suppliers. We really want to understand our supply chains, and we want to play a much more active role in driving sustainability and continuous improvement going forward. And to be able to do that, we've got to analyze our supply chains. The starting point is figuring out where it all comes from. But then, overarching to that, we might not be subject to the pull of regulations, but the sustainability challenges are universal. We are affected by things like climate change and deforestation, social justice in our supply chains as well. So that's a major driver. And then ultimately, we source commodities from some of the world's leading suppliers. It's done a lot of work in traceability and in sustainability itself. And we have great stories to tell, and really understanding our suppliers, working with our suppliers allows us to do that.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know we'll have some more questions for you on sort of what Woolworths is prioritizing as we head into 2025. But I want to turn things over to Forrest and ask a similar question. In your role at Lowe's, what are some of the ways in which traceability has impacted Lowe's business?
First of all, thank you for having me. Great event. So I think that's one thing to clarify about this whole supply chain transparency. People always think that supply chain transparency equal to forced labor, right? But Gert already set a stone that we are here. We also see other benefits, right? Deforestation. We see that from the wood sourcing perspective. Confident mineral. We have been hearing this for so long, and now it's start to give us the tool to clarify the supply chain, and we will be able to know where those raw materials comes from. So I think that's there are so many benefits for supply chain transparency. But to come back to your question about how this impact Lowe's, I think 3 things I can share with you. So first, I think will be supply chain resiliency, right? So by knowing where the raw materials comes back, you will be easier or in a better position to monitor anything happens to your supply chain, how this is going to disrupt your retail world later. The example will be during COVID-19, right? We see there was a shutdown in China. People thought that, we'd be fine because we already diversify our product supply from Vietnam, Thailand, and other Southeast Asian countries. But guess what? The key raw material may come from China, and because the factories over there are closed, you still don't have any products at all, period, right? Having a better supply chain transparency will allow us to understand that, to be more accurately foresee what are going to be the disruptions in our supply chain. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, I think is also better for risk assessment. So part of my work at Lowe's is deal with international trade, and we know that tariff was such a hot topic in the last several years, and in particular, anti-dumping, countervailing duty investigations. So I'm not trying to get into all the details about that technical word, but we know there is a procedure the U.S. Commerce can have. It's called circumvention investigations. It's basically if there's dumping duties imposed on products from China. However, the Chinese supplier decided to move to Vietnam and just create a shell company trying to supply the product from that country. Then the U.S. Commerce can potentially, trace that and chase after that new suppliers in Vietnam. So knowing your supply chain will allow us to better understand that, hey, if there's a new dumping duty investigations in Vietnam, or there's a circumvention proceedings happening, am I dealing with a true local foreign supplier, or I'm dealing with a supplier that from a country previously subject to the dumping duty, now just come to another country, right? So this is second benefits we have seen. So the third thing we have seen differently, or how this impact us, is we start to cultivate the trust between us and our suppliers, because we've been very transparent with our vendors why we want to understand the supply chain. And the vendors who are willing to share the data with us are the one put a lot of faith in us, knowing that we are trying to do the right thing. Knowing that today the trust among people could be tricky, right? We are living in such a controversial world. But by having this supply chain transparency, people start to work together, right? Doesn't matter whether it's retailer, the supplier, first tier, second tier. We all work together because we are going to the same goal to increase the supply chain transparency. Good for you, good for suppliers, good for everyone. So I think it's start to cultivate the culture of trust and collaboration. And I think that's the other thing, that how this impact flows.
Thank you so much for that, Forrest. You touched on some really great points that I want to make sure we're underscoring. The first being that traceability is not just about forced labor. I think that particularly in the context of the U.S. forced labor regulation, that's oftentimes an association that companies are making. That's sort of the end goal of any traceability project or traceability objective is to root out forced labor in the supply chain. That is an outcome of a traceability endeavor, but there are so many other benefits to having that upstream transparency, as you mentioned. And the point that you ended on that I think is just, again, really important to underscore is this is a practice that helps develop stronger relationships with your suppliers. And there are so many positive outcomes to that in and of itself. And so this really is something that all companies should be embarking on, whether or not they are exposed to some of these major supply chain due diligence regulations. So thank you so much for those points. Nate, I want to turn back to you here. So traceability has been critical for companies that import into the United States, particularly this year. Most companies have at least begun to think about a traceability strategy. Of course, the ones that are importing into the United States have had now over 2 years to prepare for things like the UFLPA and the due diligence that's required by law there. But are there any best practices that you've seen from AAFA members that have implemented these due diligence strategies, not just to comply with U.S. forced labor laws, but all of the laws coming out of North America? Of course, we know Canada has a supply chain due diligence law. Mexico does as well. Are there any trends that you can share, anything you've seen that may be helpful for our audience today?
Yeah, I think the biggest one, and going back to Forrest's just previous answer and what you just described, is that you need to be, when you look at traceability as a company, the ones that are most successful are looking at this from a holistic approach. That you can't just be looking, oh, I'm just trying to comply with UFLPA or the forced labor statutes, or I'm just trying to comply with this due diligence legislation. You need traceability in order to accomplish all of your goals. So you're talking about product safety, sustainability. You set goals, or you're saying you're going to eliminate chemicals in your supply chain. You need to have visibility all the way back in your supply chain. And Forrest's point that this is not even just on these issues, but this could be a trade issue, an anti-dumping and countervailing duty case issue. You need that visibility everywhere, because you don't know where the connections are, and you don't know where the problems are arising in your supply chain unless you have that visibility in your supply chain. So a holistic approach is extremely important. And I think it's others is trying to get your systems in place. You can't just have one segment of your company focusing on the issue of traceability. You need to involve everyone. You need sourcing, you need sustainability, social responsibility, you need product development. you need everybody involved because they all have a piece of this because somebody's picking the suppliers that are in your supply chain and that affects who supplies them and so on and so forth. And so you need everybody engaged. There's many other best practices are out there, but I'll just stop with those two.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sure that, given how many members AAFA has, there are so many potentially interesting, case studies from companies that have, success stories, but also stories of learnings and, practices that maybe didn't work and they needed to, adjust their strategies. Forrest, you talked a little bit about how traceability can help as part of sort of fostering those stronger relationships with your suppliers. Of course, even with that, supplier responsiveness can be a big hurdle in the data collection process. What are some of the major challenges that Lowe's has faced that you're of course comfortable sharing? And how have you responded to this issue or similar issues in the past?
Well, this is a great question. I mean that's we are in the middle of our vendor forum for our private brands. We just had one last week, and we're having one next week in Thailand. And so people was like, "Hey, Forrest, can you speak with our vendors about this initiative? Can you press them?" I was like, "Okay, legal is going to force people to do that." But it doesn't always happen that way, right? So yes, we do see pushback, we do see hurdles. Because when you have this initiative, you basically see people who respond with great details. People may choose to respond with poor data. And then you will also see a large group who will be no response or just say no to you, right? So let's talk about that, the serve buckets, how we deal with that. I think the first thing we're trying to do is trying to build a trust with them, right? So it's just like, I was joking with my wife. It's just like dating her when we were young. It takes time. The trust is not built like overnight. You have to take time to communicate to them why you're doing this, how you will use the data, and why it's important for all of us, right? So if you are trying to think about using the data for cost out opportunities, or you are trying to use that data to potentially circumvent your tier one supplier, go to the tier two in the future to cut off the middle person, that would never work, right? So don't come into the communication with agenda, just to say, hey, I want to know you more. Let me know what are the pain points for you, right? So having that communication builds a trust. And again, it takes time. It's take repeated conversations with them. The second way we do it is we have when we have the conversation, we're trying to understand why they are saying no, right? Are they saying no because they don't want to do that? Or they're saying no because they don't understand the process, do not have sufficient training for them so that they can edit information correctly. Or maybe there is a technology platform limitation that they are not going to be able to access, having easier access. Or they may have language barrier. The platform is only in English or in another foreign language that people don't necessarily understand, right? Understand the limitations, right? Trying to see whether this is something we can help them, right? So I think this is not a market pitch. I mean, it's you guys Sourcemap, you having the platform that is widely used by different retailers, right? You have the platform that's in multiple languages. So I think that this is beneficial for people because when you have a tier one, tier two, or tier four supplier trying to use a platform, they may say, "Oh, I have done this for another retailer. Oh, this platform looks very familiar to me." So improve that user experience for your suppliers, and that may be easier way for them to get on to the platform and I feel like, oh, I can spend 15 minutes just trying to answer those questions, right? As retailers, we know how consumer experience is critical. If you have bad experience, regardless what kind of product you have online or in your stores, customers don't come to you. They are sometimes today, they are not only shopping for cost-sensitive products, but also shopping for the experience, right? So I think that's the same thing we should think about. The other thing that we have seen is to show some common interest, share the common interest with our suppliers. So think about that. We are doing supply chain transparency for very clear reasons. But I recently looked at the top 10 US importer of record. Companies like Samsung, LG Appliance, they're also in top 10. As importers, also as suppliers, I bet they have strong interest in supply chain transparency, because whatever retailers are facing, the same challenges also occur to them. So if they are able to do that, a small appliance retailer suppliers may be able to do the same. At the same time, if a supplier in appliance division is able to do this, okay, suppliers in apparel, you have less component in your products, you do that. Suppliers in tools, you have less components, your products is quite straightforward with parts, can you do that, right? So if you have the top leaders, in this supplier or vendor community taking the lead and showing great example to others, that also helps to draw everyone to the same goal. The last thing I want to say that I really like when they said is that this is not about the legal efforts, right? This is about global sourcing team, QA, merchandising, others. When you have everyone within your organization huddle together and lock hands, show in front of your vendor community, they understand that this is not a legal agenda. This is a Lowe's corporate agenda, right? This is our corporate initiative. And more importantly, I think more retailers or more companies doing this will show vendor community that this is even an industry initiative, right? So the more we show this strongly in front of our vendor community and suppliers, the easier for everyone to push toward our goal. Because again, the goal is not trying to kick them out of the supply chain. The goal is to increase the supply chain transparency so everyone can mitigate the risk.
Those are some really great points, and I hope our audience is taking copious notes, because Forrest really did just share some pro tips. I think particularly when you were speaking about sort of the shared interest that a retailer might have with its suppliers is really, really critical, especially when we're thinking about compliance with U.S. regulations and others. Gert, I want to switch over to you here. Our audiences in the U.S. will be really interested to hear more about your expertise in aquaculture and fisheries, particularly given there's been a recent focus on the U.S. side on traceable seafood by regulators. Are there any unique challenges to tracing fish and seafood that you can share?
So I'm going to start off by saying that within a global food system context, seafood is already one of the most sustainable foods out there. But there seems to be an additional layer of scrutiny and additional focus on sustainability in seafood. And I think it's understandable if you look at the integral role that oceans play in life, in climate change, absorbing the heat from global warming, and just as part of our culture, we all enjoy going to the beach and going to this. So if you look at seafood supply chain specifically, they're tremendously complex and traditionally they've been opaque. With seafood, you have two great production systems, wild capture fisheries and aquaculture. And if you look at wild capture fisheries, there's a record of more than 2,500 species being caught. There's 150 coastal states involved in capture fisheries. there's thousands of fisheries out there using 58 different capture methods. There's 4.5 million fishing boats out there. If you look at aquaculture, 20 million fish farms globally. We've got more than 12 production systems. You can have intensive, semi-intensive, hyper-intensive production, more than 500 species. Underpinning all of these or involved in all of these, more than 500 NGOs, considering seafood and the oceans and conservation, all of them with different ideas on what is sustainable and what's not sustainable. So, there's really a lot going on within the seafood environment. If you look at Woolworths specifically, we currently sell 43 species of seafood that we source from 32 countries. We have around 156 companies in our supply chains that we know of. I think there's probably another 20 or so we're looking towards discovering through using the Sourcemap platform. So there's just great complexity. If you look at how the seafood supply chain have responded to this, I think they're used to some level of intrusion, if I can call it that. Seafood has been subject to certification and other forms of sustainability assurance for more than 20 years. But there are some. There's a bit of sustainability management fatigue creeping in. There's lots of systems out there. The demand for them is great. I think for us as Woolworths, we have a very specific vision regarding this. If I look at the first sort of 10 years of our Fishing for the Future sustainability program, a lot of it based on compliance and reporting, so a lot of box ticking initially. We have a different vision now. We don't want to police our supply chains beyond 2030. Our goal now is that every one of our suppliers is a sustainability champion or leader. So we try and sell this in terms of it really is the start of a different approach towards seafood sustainability assurance. We think there's great technologies currently being developed. I mean, we've gone from paper questionnaires towards the cloud-based Sourcemap system for engaging with suppliers. We really want to link customers to this. We can responsibly source seafood. If our customers don't buy it, it's not sustainable either. So we really want to drag them into the process. But ultimately, so for us, it's a lot about data collection. We're trying to sell that vision towards the seafood producers, and ultimately, I think we're on a journey towards really optimizing seafood supply chain assurance. I think AI is going to play a big role in the future. I think we're going to go from having evidence-based assurance schemes to being able to predict what we do. So it really is a journey for us. There's a lot of value to be taken from this, but great complexity. There's not a dull day in the seafood industry.
Thank you so much. I think there's so much of what companies that have really multifaceted supply chains with a lot of different products and commodities and materials are worried about are sort of those unique challenges that may be unique to one industry or over another. And as traceability really becomes the norm, as we've been saying, not just for compliance, but also because a company has instituted more responsible sourcing practices, or this is just a day-to-day part of their business. They do need to sort of factor in what are some challenges they may face for their seafood supply chains compared to their apparel supply chains, for example. So really helpful insights there. Thank you for sharing those. Forrest, I want to turn back to you here. So in your role, you have been able to sort of spearhead some of these traceability programs and work with internal stakeholders, but implementing those traceability programs, I mean, they involve so many teams, departments. I'm sure that it can be challenging to get everybody on the same page and everybody on board. How was Lowe's able to get those key internal stakeholders invested in and excited about traceability as a concept?
Well, Marissa, I may be the wrong person to ask that questions, right? So thinking about that, getting people excited. When people heard that we are thinking about doing this, they were like, can we do that? Can we do this? And I gave them the standard in-house legal counsel response, which is no, right? because immediately people were starting thinking about cost out. People would immediately think about price negotiation. People were thinking about that. Now I'm able to know the next tier. Can I potentially go to the next tier? Right? This will break the covenant, the trust we had for our suppliers. And I have to explain to them that in most cases, I'm trying to assist my clients, but also because of my job, I also need to tell them sometimes the answer that they don't necessarily want to hear, which is no in this case, right? But it doesn't hurt the collaboration because set aside the potential benefits people may see that may be detrimental to the vendor relationship. People see also other benefits that without doing those things, how this can benefit Lowe's and also vendor. People see that mutual benefits. So I think there are a couple ways so we did this. First is we try to highlight the benefits, right? Because when you talk with your finance partners, they're thinking about cost out. You talk with your merchandising team, they're thinking about, can I go to the next tier, right? So forget it. Let me tell you what are the other benefits you can have by going through supply chain transparency, right? So highlight those benefits. And also because there is law behind this, right? And they said Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Yes, that is real. That is for real. So you have the weight of law behind you to tell people that this is something that you may have to do it, right? You don't want, CBP do another survey among, top 20 importers and find out that, oh, you don't have a way to trace your supply chain back to the upstream, suppliers. You don't want to have that, right? So you see that weight, and then you also frequently receiving increase from your investors, right? Consumers, you have that external pressure on you to make sure that you have that supply chain transparency. So highlight those benefits to your internal stakeholders so that everyone understands that, hey, don't just think about your work, think of broadly how this is going to benefit Lowe's as a company and also for our suppliers, right? So this is the first thing. The second thing is that, which we do that's quite general, as a general practice as an in-house attorney, is involving your clients early. Don't try to surprise them, right? Make sure that everyone understands is this happening and set the boundary with them saying that this is something you could do with the data. This is something you cannot, right? Clarify this with everyone, level set the expectation so that no one is surprised and that everyone is fully engaged. So I think that this is the second thing that I'm trying to do with my internal business clients. The other thing is that set the goal, right? After all, you want to have a way to tell the story. Tell the story to your board, to your investor, to external stakeholder that we're doing this, here our goal, here where we are, right? So set a realistic goal, right? Don't say that I'm going to achieve 100% supply chain transparency. That's not going to happen. Tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, you will hit the great wall. So I use great wall, very common, way with my client. I say that you will hit that great wall very, very soon. And at that point, if you set a too aggressive goal, you won't be able to achieve that. Then the other thing that we want to do is that even though legal may be pushing this, legal may be spearhead this, but it is important to earn the support from my business clients because guess what? They're funding this, right? It's probably not coming from legal budget or my personal paycheck. It's coming from my business clients, margin or whatever, budgets they have. So if they are running very thin or they don't have the resources, It is my job to help them to put together a story or put together the case so that we can actually make sure that they get enough resources to support this, right? It is my job. While I'm spearhead this, I need to make sure that I give sufficient information to my business clients so that they know how they can get the needed resources from our leadership team, the buy-in from the leadership team. So the last thing I want to share that is, well, this maybe get our clients excited is celebrate, right? If you are able to achieve, let's say 50% of your tier one, celebrate that milestone. If you get to tier 3, tier 4, or even tier 5, all the way to raw material, celebrate that because people need to get excited. People need to get excited. People need to get engaged, right? I cannot get them excitement from other things, but here is the way that I can show them, give them the credit, right? Let them to show our leadership team that, hey, we are able to achieve XYZ percentage in whatever time frame. We are getting to tier 4, tier 5. Let them to tell the story to others. The more advocates you have, the more excited they are, so the easier for you to push forward that project. That helps?
Absolutely. I think you said something that I just love, and I think all companies can use this as sort of a mantra to celebrate those milestones, celebrate those wins, and to do that, set realistic goals because we all know that supply chain traceability, supply chain transparency, there are challenges. And to your point, setting a goal of 100%, you're going to be disappointed at each milestone if you haven't achieved that yet. And so instead, focusing on those realistic objectives and celebrating as you're hitting those milestones, I think is such a great advice and such a great way to get your stakeholders and your leadership team in particular really, really excited.
Yeah, so I mean, it's one thing to add that so Nate and the other retailer association, you all have host that monthly call on forced labor, right? Everyone once they heard supply chain, if they only connect to forced labor, they were like, "Oh, again," right? That's their reaction. That is realistic. That is what is happening, right? But if they hear like, "Oh, we get to tier 4, or we get to 50%," that's the excitement, right? That's what you need. That's the momentum you need from the team so that you can continue doing this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Nate, I want to turn over to you here and talk a little bit about apparel and textiles in particular. So, this is a sector where, compared to others, it has a little bit more experience in supply chain mapping and traceability from before the U.S. forced labor ban went into effect in 2022, or at least the UFLPA went into effect in 2022. But this obviously wasn't a universal practice across the industry, despite that increase in experience. So, can you talk a little bit about how industry leaders, even amongst AAFA membership, because I know that there are quite a few industry leaders amongst your members, really paved the way for other companies to adopt similar traceability strategies?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a good point. We've been having a traceability conference here at American Apparel and Footwear Association since 2008. So we've been talking about this issue for a very long time. Regrettably, I want to say that everybody's solved this and gotten all the way back to the raw material and everything's done. Regrettably, I can't say that. But what we've learned through this process and what the industry leaders have tried to demonstrate to others in the industry and to other industries is that you can do this and you can even share this information publicly and the sky doesn't fall. So many folks on this conference probably have heard of Open Supply Hub. And this is a transparency initiative that is wants companies to share their supply chains, starting with the first tier, but going beyond. And people and the industry leaders in our industry have been putting their information out on Open Supply Hub, not just their first tier, but second tier, and in some cases, their third tier suppliers, to demonstrate not only that the transparency, but also to demonstrate that the world doesn't end if you share this information publicly. What many people find out is, well, particularly when you get to the second, third, and fourth tier, many people are sharing the same second, third, fourth tier suppliers because there's only so many of those suppliers that exist out there. And so it's a good learning experience. And if you're not willing to share that information, then you can't work together on those tiers in terms of compliance. Because the second step with traceability is once you know who these entities are, you have to try and ensure compliance on these entities. You can't hide your head in the ground anymore. You have to actually do something about it. And so, but at the same time, these companies don't have leverage at the tier two, tier three. And in our industry, we don't even, in most cases, own the tier one facility that makes the shirt or the shoe. And so, in order to affect change at tier two, tier three, and beyond, you need to work with others. And you can't do that unless you're willing to share that information and then try and combine the leverage so that you can actually have an impact at those levels in terms of compliance.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Nate. A follow-up question to you. A slight shift in gears, but I want to talk a little bit about sort of what's coming next in terms of these regulations that your team is tracking, that our team is tracking. So a highly anticipated law coming out of the EU is the digital product passport, which would make it easier for consumers to have access to that traceability data about the products that they buy. What are your thoughts on consumer-facing traceability, and what are some things that you hope regulators will implement in order for this law to be effective?
I think the first thing is not exactly related to traceability, but it's related to transparency, which is part of traceability. And that is to allow for the use of digital labeling for all the required labeling information. So the digital product passport, the idea is that you're supposed to be delivering that through an RFID tag, a barcode, a QR code to the consumer so that the consumer can scan whatever delivery vehicle you have on, in our case, the garment, the shirt or the shoe, and they'll be able to get all the information about the sustainability of the product. How much recycled materials used, what's the carbon impact, so on and so forth, which is great. But if you're adding that digital label on top of all the other thousands of labels that are already on that shirt or shoe, you're actually hurting sustainability because you're creating more label tape. But also you're creating a lot of confusion among consumers that there should be just one digital access point and they can get all their information, not only what's available through the digital product passport, but also what's available on care information, fiber content information, country of origin, so on and so forth. So that's the first point I would make. The second point with digital product passport is that because it's requiring all this information, you have to make sure that you're comparing apples and apples. You're not comparing apples and origins here. And so you need to make sure that the information you're collecting and how you're collecting that information is the same. And so the key is getting it right at the start in terms of how do you define a sustainable product. So that's very important. But the other part of this, getting back to the traceability, and I know that's what we're talking about here, is that you, in order to truly show the carbon impact of your product, or if the product uses sustainable materials or the product's had an environmental impact somewhere in the product's history, is that you have to have the traceability in order to do that. You can't say, oh, well, this product has no environmental impact, but at the dyeing facility, there was an issue with effluents or wastewater going into the rivers around the dyeing facility or things like that. You need to have that visibility all the way through. The carbon impact, it could not be the factory made the shirt. It could be the mill that made the yarn is producing a lot of carbon emissions. You need to have that information. And so again, traceability is going to be critical for the digital product passport to be successful.
Thank you so much, Nate. I know we're sort of approaching our time here, but I want to just sort of underscore some of the really excellent points that my fellow panelists made today. and hopefully leave our audience with some key takeaways from this discussion. I mean, the number one point that I think we've reiterated across this discussion is that traceability is not just about forced labor. This is an effective and important strategy for all aspects of your business. Forrest mentioned that if you have a robust traceability program in place, you're monitoring for things like disruptions in your supply chain. You're able to source more responsibly. None of us could have, predicted how disruptive the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic was for supply chains, but it was a wake-up call for a lot of companies to say, okay, there are more reasons that I need to know where my products are coming from and exactly which suppliers I'm sourcing from, to get ahead of potential disruptions that are outside of regulatory compliance, and outside of a human rights risk use case or an environmental risk use case. Another key point that I really want to underscore is it's imperative that you foster strong relationships with your suppliers. If you're able to build that trust, you have a much higher likelihood of getting that critical information from your suppliers, and you're able to kind of approach the problem from that position of shared interest. Your suppliers are not only subject to the same regulatory requirements that your organization is subject to, but there are other advantages for them as well, to have more transparent supply chains and those stronger relationships with your business. So that's really an important takeaway for our audience. And then finally, acknowledging that there may be some unique challenges depending on which industry or sector you belong to, which commodities you're sourcing. This is really critical in assessing the risks that are unique to your upstream supply chain, and being able to really remediate those risks. And then finally, I want to underscore again a great point that was made during this panel: setting those realistic expectations, celebrating the small and the big wins. Those are some key things that help get internal stakeholders on board, to make traceability a priority for your organization. And as we head into 2025, this is only going to be more and more important. It's not just because the list of regulations that require supply chain mapping, supply chain transparency, I mean, that list is increasing every day. But also that this is becoming a commonplace for most companies to have a traceability program in place, to have more transparent supply chains. And so the companies that do not prioritize this are becoming more the minority in the global marketplace. And this is a tool to remain competitive, not just amongst your peers, but with consumers. Nate mentioned, the digital product passport and how this is consumer-facing traceability. Consumers are also looking to purchase products that they perceive as, responsibly sourced, and ethically sourced. And so this is not just a driver, again, on the regulatory side or even the internal as an internal priority for your business, but consumers are pushing companies to prioritize this as well. So some really, really, I think, important takeaways from this group. I feel like I learned a lot. This was an expert panel with some really diverse perspectives. So I thank you three for this really engaging discussion. And we're going to wrap things up there, and we're going to transition to our next panel in a few minutes. But again, I want to thank you, Nate, Forrest, Gert. Thank you so much for this great discussion today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for
Thank
having
you.
me.